Welcome to Oricl Class 309, yet even more stories from the Secret City. This is March the 3rd, 2025. And I'm Ray Smith, and I'm glad to have you here. And we will be talking this next three sessions we're having. We've got one today with Alan Lowe, who will talk to us about presidents and his association with them over the years, and anything else that Alan wants to talk about. As you know, he's the executive director of the American Museum of Science and Energy and K-25 Atomic History Center, and other things. He has other things going on. And then next Monday we'll have Dennis Aislinger with us. He has brought out the second edition of his book, The Oak Ridge Prophet Revealed. And then on the 17th, Robert Burnham will be here with his second book on the Armageddon secret about the German nuclear weapons program. So today we're going to have Alan Lowe, and let me assure you that he can, while he'll be making a presentation, let me assure you that he can answer your questions at any time you want to interrupt. So I appreciate you keeping your microphone muted when you're not wanting to talk, because sometimes we can get feedback or we can get noise from around you that will be a little disturbing. So try to keep your microphone muted, except, and I encourage this, except when you want to talk to us or ask us a question. I find that we have a much better enjoyable time if we can have interaction with the audience. And I'm sure Alan agrees with that. So if there's not any questions, and also be thinking about this, what would you like me to focus on? I'll have these guests, just like I've told you I'm going to, but we'll also have some time that we can talk about anything that you would like to bring up. So at the end of each session, I'll try to remember to ask if there are any specific things, stories, or information you'd like to have shared here that we can bring in and do some research on, or bring another guest in for the ensuing two sessions after this one. Any questions or comments before we turn it over to Alan? All right, Alan, you've got the normal, really good Oricl class here.
Good. I'm excited.
They're quieter than most, but they do sometimes have some good questions. So
Good,
if you
good.
want to go ahead and by the way, add more introduction of yourself if you like, because I have not done a good job of that. So tell them a little about yourself and share your screen, and let's get started.
All right, let's see if that is there. And we'll do this there. That's look good. Can everyone see
Yep,
that?
yep.
All
Everyone,
right,
it
good
looks
deal.
good.
Very good. Well, thank you, Ray. Always great to see you and great to see the class. I love Oricl, and what an amazing organization it is for this community, and glad to be talking with you today. I'm going to talk about the presidents I've known or I've been associated with throughout the years, but I have to say to start. At the American Museum of Science and Energy and K-25 Atomic History Center, we have a lot going on. So make sure you check out amz.org for all of our upcoming programs. We do sci-fi film series. We have a family game night. On March 28th, we have our annual gala coming up. So check out our website. You can see tickets there and sponsorship opportunities, all these great things. It's going to be a fun night at AMZ on March 28th. So make sure you check that out. And so much happening at K-25 this year. You'll see big changes out there with the premiere of the Interpretive Center, work going on at Portal 4. So lots more to come at the K-25 Atomic History Center and the Heritage Center. We're very excited about everything in the future at both of our museums. But today, we're all about the presidents. I've been very fortunate over the years to work at several of the presidential libraries. I went to UK, which gets me in trouble around here, and got my degree in history, but kind of lucked into a job at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Museum to start. That's in originally in Los Angeles, California, ultimately at that beautiful building you see in the lower left up in Simi Valley, California. That's about 45 miles northwest of downtown LA. I didn't know what a presidential library was. I joke, and it's a true story, when I interviewed, I kind of fibbed and told them it had been my lifelong dream to work at a presidential library, but I really had no earthly idea what it was. I knew they were going to pay me, I think, $22,000 a year, which sounded like a fortune, and I might get to meet Ronald Reagan, which I did. So made the move from Lexington, Kentucky, out to LA in September of '89. At that point, the Reagan Library was just a hole in the ground. The archives, the papers, and the artifacts, and a small amount of electronic records just beginning were moved out from the White House into this huge warehouse in Los Angeles. It was a converted pasta factory. And I worked there with my fellow archivist. I learned how to be an archivist. As a history student, I certainly used archives, but I had no idea of what an archivist job entailed, really. And that's where I was put into boot camp, essentially, of how you review
Okay, they're gonna want me to
That
mute.
just says view.
and preserve records and make them ultimately available to people. Um, I won't get into all the inside baseball with this unless you all want to later about access, but we had to implement something called the Presidential Records Act for the first time ever at the Reagan Library. So archivists there were trained on a whole new set of legislation that governed how people can access those records through the Freedom of Information Act. And we can talk a bit more about that later. There you see up in the upper right, my first meeting with Ronald Reagan. He would come to our Christmas parties. Loved him dearly. He talked to us that day for a long time, especially about the library and the museum, what was planned for it. He told Hollywood stories. I was kind of in heaven. You see in the lower right, a later meeting. At that point, as you'll hear later, I was with Senator Howard Baker. We went back out shortly after the president's death and had a meeting with Mrs. Reagan, and Senator Baker spoke at the Reagan Museum that night. A very poignant moment with Mrs. Reagan. We went out to the gravesite, which is there on site, and she sat by the graveside silently for about 5 minutes with us behind her, and it was really very touching scene. So, and Senator Baker, of course, was White House Chief of Staff for a brief time for President Reagan, who was very close to him. So that was a very interesting and again, very touching moment there. So Reagan, one of my favorite stories with him is I was sent up once with my friend Greg Cumming, who now works at the Nixon Library. We were fledgling archivists, and we were sent to their home in Bel Air. You know, the Reagans had a house in Bel Air and one over in the Santa Ynez Valley where this ranch was. But the Bel Air home is where they said there's a bunch of stuff the president wants to donate. Go up and get that and bring it back. And so Greg and I drove in his pickup truck up to the Bel Air. And when we drove into the property, we realized the president and Mrs. Reagan must be there because, oh, I'm getting someone in. They must be there because there was a lot of Secret Service. But I thought, you know, someone will hand me a series of packages and we'll leave. But as I walked up toward the door, Ronald Reagan opened it and said, "Hey, fellas, I've been waiting on you. Where you been?" And laughed. And we talked for a good half an hour in his living room about things I'm forgetting now because of my age and because I was kind of beside myself that I was sitting down with Ronald Reagan. But I know we talked about the museum. He was very excited about its development, how it was proceeding. He wanted to know all about us. And again, very kind to very young men at that point coming into his house. So, and Mrs. Reagan, the same way then and later when I interacted with her with Senator Baker. So if you go out there, if you go to the LA or Southern California area, make sure you go to the Reagan Library Museum. Again, it's not a long drive unless you hit bad traffic coming up from LA. The building you see there has changed since I worked there. That big white section on the left, that was added when I was back in Washington when they were deeded an old Air Force One plane. So if you go there, you can walk through Air Force One. They also have a Marine One, which is the helicopter. They have a presidential limousine. Really great addition to the museum experience, all in that white building. You do it as you go through, kind of halfway through the museum exhibit. Right.
So, Alan, that was your first exposure to presidential libraries.
That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
went out. Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I went out not really knowing what it was. I was among they had a supervisor there, national security person there, and the big guy there. And then I was one of the two first archivists hired. My friend Greg and I were there alone for 2 weeks learning how to process records before they brought in the rest of the archivists. I think at the end of the day, there were about 10 of us archivists there, processing records and doing reference requests eventually. So it was, yeah, fascinating stuff, but I had no idea what it was.
What a good way to get introduced to it, though.
That's right. It was a quick baptism. Luckily, the National Archives did a great job of training us. Within being in LA 2 weeks, I was back in Washington in the middle of a bunch of training, and it was really a good experience in that regard. Made lifelong friends, and realized. I say that's when I started realizing how much an institution like that, or an institution like AMSI and K25, how much we can impact a community and be a force of good. So being, programming and access to archives, all these things that these institutions, these cultural institutions wrap into their being of how that can really serve a community and beyond. So I'm always thankful to the National Archives for what they did for me, but also what they do for the country. I went back in 1992, unexpectedly got the opportunity to go back to the Office of Presidential Libraries in the National Archives. And there you see the main archives building at 7th and Penn, where I worked for a long time. I was with the National Archives in Washington a total of 11 years. The last couple in another building in College Park, Maryland, called Archives 2. Always joke that we don't have a lot of imagination. We named the new building Archives 2, but it's a mammoth facility out at the University of Maryland campus because we've really outgrown this historic building. This is the original National Archives building. I was up on the mezzanine level of this for probably, I guess, 8.5 of that 11 years.
And
So
where's this one located?
the new buildings in College Park, Maryland, right on
Right.
on the edge of the University of Maryland campus. This one is in downtown DC, right on Pennsylvania,
Got it.
right on Pennsylvania Avenue, not far from the kind of midway between the Capitol and the White House, right on Pennsylvania. If you know, the Smithsonian is one block over at the Smithsonian Museum, the main Smithsonian, like American history and natural history and all those are, and the National Gallery of Art is one block over behind the picture you're seeing here.
Mhm.
So it's a great place. They have a great museum. When I first got there, the National Archives Museum, where they show the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that was great, but the museum around it was not. It is terrific now. They've done a complete redo of that, and there's some wonderful exhibits and programming that they do there. Um, our job at the Office of Presidential Libraries was to oversee the system of libraries throughout the country. That at that point started with Hoover, and eventually it goes up through George W. Bush, and I'll tell you more about why Obama's not on that list necessarily at this point. But it goes up through that. It was started by FDR, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And our job was to oversee and advocate, I always said, to make sure that they did their job. And I was director of operations ultimately, so I had a very big portfolio because it was a very small office. So everything from personnel to budgets to some access issues to legal issues. I was on the road a lot, the best schoolhouse possible on how to run a museum and an archives, because I was kind of that young guy who came in saying, how can I help fix whatever this issue is? We also advocated for them. So I was, and along with a couple of my colleagues, we were the ones in meetings saying, this is what we need in the budget. This is what we need to help with this facility, or with these are the additional staff members we need, that type of thing. So I got to know the system really, really well and absolutely loved my time there. Now, part of my time in that office was working in presidential moves. When I first got back, I don't have any good pictures of it, but the first thing I had to do was to help with the move of George H.W. Bush from Washington back to College Station, Texas. He lost the election, as you may recall, in 1992. I'd arrived back there in January of 92. I was detailed to the White House, and our job at the National Archives is to box up everything and send it to a warehouse wherever the presidential library is going to be built. We also have to find that warehouse and retrofit it to meet all the the security and temperature and humidity requirements and staffing requirements for those materials. So for H.W. Bush, a whole staff went down and found a Chinese restaurant and bowling alley that was converted to a warehouse in really quick order. I was on the team that then separately went to the White House and worked for several months to box up everything. I joked that I was kind of the angel of death because they had lost the election. I was the guy saying, reminding them that they lost the election and, hey, I'm here for your records. And we would box up, we'd inventory as quickly as possible. And then a whole set of Marines were there from the Pentagon. They would help us put it on pallets, get it out to Andrews, and then we shipped them to Texas. At the end of the day, I think there were 7 or 8 C-5 planes full of materials we shipped out of Washington during a very quick turnaround. We had to have everything out before noon on Inauguration Day. What you're seeing here is many years later, I helped lead up the Clinton move to Little Rock. That was much easier because we knew President Clinton could not be reelected. He had served his 2 terms. And so we started planning a year out, very, very intense planning with the White House and the Pentagon to make sure that move was done as smoothly as possible. You're still talking an immense amount of paper records, of artifacts, and with Clinton, also electronic records. Really, that's the first presidential administration where you see fairly extensive use of emails. I think at the end of the day, about 4 million emails were created during the Clinton administration. So getting those transferred over also was part of our responsibility. There you see President Clinton with some boxes packed behind him. And I always joke, you see me on the right side there. Near the end of his administration, he knew we were moving stuff. That's me with hair, by the way. He knew we were moving stuff for him. He was very, very happy with that. And so he had a little reception for us up in the residence of the White House. It was very nice, but I joke that whole day, all we had there was like wine and cheese, and there was no coffee or Diet Coke. And when the president finally came into the room, he had a Diet Coke in his hand. And I'm so obsessed with caffeine. You see in my official photo there, I'm staring at his Diet Coke. And I thought it's very, very, very symbolic. I want to say, where did you get that, and how can I get one? But I thought twice and didn't do it. But again, very much appreciate it for him to do that for our crew that was still at that point still busily moving stuff down to Little Rock. And that went into what was an old car dealership, got that retrofitted, and eventually into the beautiful Clinton Library right down there in downtown Little Rock. During part of my time in Washington, I was also with Central Office of Presidential Libraries. They asked me to be acting director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum in Hyde Park, New York. You see that library museum on the left-hand side of the slide. I did that, I think, from 97 to 98. I'm losing track of time and space. It's either 97, 98 or 98, 99. And it was a great experience. That was the first presidential library that then set the trend for future presidential libraries. So FDR realized that if you looked at presidents before him, oftentimes they would go home, they'd take their materials with them because at that point they still belonged to them, and they would be lost to fires or future generations selling them or getting scattered here and there among family members or friends or just getting lost. Library of Congress had done a fairly good job of collecting materials where they could. Historical societies and so forth had tried, but he realized those records needed to be preserved and provided to the American people, along with a museum that helps teach the history and civics and so forth, so important to a republic. So he built and gave over to the National Archives that Presidential Library and Museum you see there on the left-hand side. That again, setting the model that went up through President George W. Bush. So built by private funds, private foundations, and then deeded to the National Archives. It stopped with President Obama, and again, there's a lot of inside baseball here. I know way too much about this, but it stopped because the Congress increased the required endowment that the funding foundation would give us astronomically. Starting with George H.W. Bush, they said there's an endowment. So not only did the foundation give you the building, but they also have to give you an endowment to help with the maintenance of it. Okay, that's fine. And that endowment was based on a fairly complex formula, but it really comes down to if you're given a building and property, the foundation also had to give you an endowment worth 20% of the value of what they gave you. So, for example, the George W. Bush Library in Dallas, where I was director, and you'll hear about in a minute, I wasn't allowed to accept the building until I got a $9 million check from the foundation for the endowment. So that was 20%. With Obama, Congress changed it to 60% of the land value and building value. So at that point, I think the Obama Foundation realized if we go by the old model, at the very least, we'll have a $27 million to $30 million endowment we'll have to give. And so I think that's my thought is that's why the Obama Foundation decided they're going to run the museum in Chicago. It's being built now. It will not be part of the National Archives system. The records still belong to us, the American people, under the Presidential Records Act. And my understanding is they were in Chicago. They've either been moved back to Washington or they're going to be moved back to Washington and administered by the National Archives. So now that function that have been together will be separate. They'll work together, obviously, but will be separate for Obama, and I would assume for future libraries. We don't know yet about President Trump or President Biden. But anyway, FDR started a trend that went for a long time, was memorialized in something called the Presidential Libraries Act. You see on the right side there, by the way, if you go to Hyde Park, which I encourage you to do, the Roosevelt Home, that's administered by the National Park Service. It's right behind the library and museum, so you get a nice joint experience there. Beautiful, beautiful home. And I think, put on here, yes, the National Park Service also runs Valkill, which is a home that Eleanor Roosevelt had built. Also had Valkill Industries there for a while as well. That's on the left-hand side of the slide. In the middle of the slide, you see something called Top Cottage. That's another smaller house that FDR had constructed, used several times before his death, that was handicapped accessible. So he built that as kind of a private retreat, again, on what was then a very large estate. And then on the right side, you see the Henry Wallace Visitor and Education Center, which was being built as one of the projects I worked on when I was acting director and was finished just as I became Howard Baker Center director down here. So that serves both the Park Service and the National Archives there in Hyde Park. So yeah, go up. It's about a 2-hour drive from New York City, or a 2-hour drive from Albany as well, and very, very much worth it. And the Vanderbilt Mansion is just right up the road too, so you can do a lot of stuff while you're in the area. And Rhinebeck, it's a beautiful little village not too far north of there as well. I left the Presidential Library and Museum world to come to Knoxville, Tennessee in 2003 to be the inaugural director of the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy at UTK, now the Howard Baker School, I'm very proud to say. I always joke when I give these presidential presentations that here's a man who I think should have been president, would have been a great president. He worked for presidents, was chief of staff to Ronald Reagan, was ambassador to Japan for George W. Bush. We put together the Baker Center, not only the institution, but we raised the funds and got that beautiful building there on Cumberland Avenue you see on the left. On the right is my first meeting with Senator Baker. He was still at that point ambassador to Japan, but could not have been a nicer person. Really a great and good man is how I say it, and had so much influence with so many presidents through the years. And we'll talk about that maybe a bit more later. I left, however, after we got the Baker Center open to be the inaugural director of the George W. Bush Library and Museum, which is on the campus of SMU in Dallas, Texas, downtown Dallas. even Senator Baker, when I told him about this, he said, I don't want to lose you, but you got to take that job. And I said, yes, sir. I think I do.
Hmm.
Um, I President and Mrs. Bush, it was near the end of the administration. The National Archives uh, ultimately chooses the director, but they obviously give a slate of possibilities to the president. And I came back in one day at the Baker Center and had a call from DC, and I didn't want to leave. I love Senator Baker, and the woman who was trying to entice me to come up to talk to them said, "Well, yeah, I understand, but tell me what you would do if you were director." And we talked for over an hour. And at the end of that, she goes, I think maybe you might be interested. Why don't you come up? And I did. About a week later, a whole set of interviews. I mean, that's really just an amazing set of interviews throughout the whole White House complex. And at the end of that, they said, we'd love for you to come back up next week and talk to the big guy. And so I went back up a week later, had a couple more ancillary meetings there in the White House, and then had to wait a whole afternoon at Old Everett Grill. If you've ever been, it's right across from the White House. Um, the legend is the bar at the Old Everett Grill was in another location, and that's where the British drank after they burned Washington. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think it is, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. But I sat there, and all I could do was drink Diet Coke, not my normal beer, because I'm going to go in and meet with the president. And sure enough, about an hour or so after I got there, they called and said he's ready. And I had a meeting in the Oval Office with him, and luckily, and with Mrs. Bush, and luckily I went very well. And at the end, he said, "What do we do next?" And one of his staff members said, "Well, you have to say yes or no, Mr. President." And he said, "The answer is yes, let's do it." And that was me. I got hired, and just about a month later, made the move down to Dallas, and absolutely loved it. We worked really hard with the Great Bush Foundation, the ones who were raising money for this beautiful facility at SMU. That includes the museum and archives, but also the private Bush Institute, where he continues to this day, along with Mrs. Bush, to do a whole host of projects here and around the world on topics like global health, human freedom. Just if you look at it, it's all the high priorities of his administration. He's continued having a role in trying to move those forward. He also, by the way, took up painting. Maybe you've seen some of his paintings. And we actually did, before I left, an exhibit of his painting. I thought it was fascinating. I walked around with him the night before we opened it just to make doubly sure he was happy with everything. And these were of foreign leaders he knew. That was the first exhibit. I think really well done. You can see how he progressed through time, his ability. He had a couple teachers, by the way, there in town, a woman to begin with, and then later a young African American man who became a very, very well regarded painter over time. But they worked very closely with the president. They saw real talent in him. Well, we were walking around this exhibit and had people like Tony Blair and so forth, and we got to the one of Vladimir Putin. And if you ever see that painting, it is compared to the others very dark and gray, very dark. I said, "Well, Mr. President, this painting looks a little different than the others." And he says, "Yeah, Alan." He goes, "When I first met Putin, I thought maybe I could work with him." He goes, "But then I figured out he's a really bad dude." I thought that was a very George W. statement. I said, "Yes, sir. I do believe he is. Yes, sir." Uh, but that went over well. I think they've done another exhibit of his paintings since then. He's done some of the veterans of the wars and so forth. And just last time I saw him in person down there, I went to their house. It's right there in Dallas. Great, great house there. And he was upstairs in his studio. He had a paint studio there in the dirtiest T-shirt you can ever imagine, an unlit cigar in his mouth, and painting away. He really enjoys it, and in real Bush family style, he does it quickly. If you remember George H.W. Bush, you may recall he played a round of golf in lightning speed. That got stuff done quickly. Well, George W. does the same, I think, with painting. One afternoon, he spoke at an event for me, and when he left, I said, "What are you going to do the rest of the afternoon, Mr. President?" He goes, "I'm going to go home and paint two paintings." So he said, "I'm like, okay, all right." He had him in his head, I guess. He knew what he was going to go paint. Um, there, there you see just a couple of things from the museum. Of course, on the far left, you see girder from the World Trade Center. We went to New York to this huge warehouse there at JFK Airport where they had put so many things from the World Trade Center. A very difficult afternoon, to be honest with you, but they wanted to donate something to the museum, and we took this. And around that, you can't really see in that photo, but all the names of the people who died that day, either there or in Pennsylvania or at the Pentagon. So another thing which I need to put a photo on here of one of my I think one of the most interesting artifacts at Bush is a print that Senator Ted Kennedy gave to Mrs. Bush on 9/11. She was on Capitol Hill that day testifying about education, her real passion. And then the attacks happened, and she was taken out very quickly. But what Senator Kennedy had for her that day, he painted, and he had a print of one of his paintings. So it didn't get to her that day. It wasn't able to go to her. Later, he sent it to her, but by then we had had the anthrax attacks. And so it went through a screening process that discolored the glass. So we were able to tell a lot of stories with that artifact of, first of all, here's Mrs. Bush working with Senator Kennedy, kind of a bipartisan effort, a focus on education. That's one story. And then the story of her being there on 9/11 and being, taken away very quickly. And then, of course, the story of the anthrax attacks, another horrible episode in our history, all reflected in that one artifact. There on the lower right, you see President Bush talking to a group of kids on our opening day. You see me very nervously awaiting in the background because he'd gone way over schedule, and I need to go open the front doors and welcome people. And he had said 15 minutes. He was at this point probably just over 30. He eventually spent almost 45 with them. And I finally went to him and said, "Well, President Bush, we have to open." He goes, "You go open. I'm going to stay here." And so I did. uh, in the upper right, you see the Decision Points Theater. Uh, Probably the part of the museum I'm proudest of. President Bush said he wanted to show the different controversies of his administration, show the differing opinions on things like the war in Iraq and the response to Hurricane Katrina. So when you go in that room, you have to assume the guise of president. And on these screens in front of you, after a big introduction on the big screen, you get on the screen in front of you, after you choose a scenario with your other people in the room, majority wins, then you have to make decisions and get advice from different people. So if it's Iraq, you might click on Pentagon or Congress, and you go your Secretary of Defense, and you get different actors that come up, and one actor will say, "Go in. You need to do this," and the other actor will say, "Worst idea ever. Don't do it." And then that way we were able to show explain the different arguments for and against these things. And you agree or disagree. At the end of the day, at the end of the exercise, you see how the room voted. And then President Bush will come on and say, you chose this scenario today. Here's what I decided to do and why I did it. So really a great experience for museum visitors. It's kind of become a model. I know Mount Vernon has taken it and run with it. They said the Decision Points Theater on steroids at Mount Vernon now with George Washington scenarios. And it's something I would love to do here someday in some way, because it's really engaging for people. I remember I had to go in, I give a tour to Justice Scalia, and we had to go in, and he wanted to do that. So I had the nerve-wracking experience of doing that with him, and making sure we ended up enjoying it immensely, but I was a little nervous that day. Speaking of nerves, you see in the middle the opening day, dedication day of the Library and Museum with the 5 presidents. So glad that H.W. Bush was able to be there. I helped President Bush give them a tour before this scene, before they came out. And I always joke I wasn't too nervous because it's so busy, opening any exhibit. I've never been part of any exhibit where you're not down to the wire. But this was a whole facility, a whole exhibit, worldwide attention. We were all kind of numb by the time we got to this opening, so I wasn't really nervous walking around with him that day. I only got nervous later. It's true, when at lunch, we had a special VIP lunch in our courtyard. I realized that standing behind me was the famous baseball player, Nolan Ryan. And when I introduced myself to him, my voice cracked. I got immediately nervous. And so finally, the nerves came out. But I don't know what he thought of me. But it was a great day. And there are just a couple more photos. You see on the right, that's me right after he'd said he was going to hire me. So that's in the Oval Office. And again, it was a great conversation. He put me at ease by talking about ranching. He knew I grew up on a farm. He'd been briefed about my background. We talked a lot about the future archives and electronic records. There on the left, you see a great day with both H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush. I'm standing in the back row next to Andy Card, former White House Chief of Staff. Right, you see Laura Bush there on the left. On the front row in front of me is Anita McBride, who's still work a lot with her. She's now part of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, but at this point had been Chief of Staff for Mrs. Bush, for Laura Bush. So just a really great experience. I will say at the Library Museum, we obviously had a great museum, but also an immense archives. I had 20 archivists who worked for me.
Wow.
We had a collection of about 70 million pages of paper records, but really the George W. Bush Library Museum was the first one significantly impacted by electronic records. So I think I said earlier, Clinton Library had around 4 million emails, 4 million pages of emails. At Bush, we had about 1 billion pages of emails.
Mm.
So that changed everything in the archives world. It made it great to have this historical record, but it also made it very challenging for us under the Freedom of Information Act. In the old days, for example, at the Reagan Library, as a reference archivist, you might come to me and say, I want everything on topic X. And we would find the stuff that's not classified or closed. We'd say, okay, we found 10,000 pages relevant to your request, paper records, essentially. At George W. Bush, a person might come and say, I want everything on topic X. And my archivist would say, well, I found 30,000 pages of paper records and 275,000 pages of electronic records. When you realize what an archivist, part of their job is, you review every line on every page before it's released.
Alan,
So,
if
yes,
if I could interrupt, and
please,
I'm going to take you for a distraction just a minute, and
please.
I know you can come back to where we are, but
Yeah,
back up one slide, if you would. Now, up in the upper right, where you're talking about, and you did a good job explaining that new exhibit of the, and by the way, obviously very, very interactive. And I applaud you for being in the lead in putting that kind of exhibit together. And the fact that it's been used as a model for others is all well and good. Now let's bring it to Oak Ridge and let's
yeah,
talk about what you're wanting to do. And my suggestion is that we have the most advanced technical capability that I think exists in the world at the Oak Ridge Enhanced Technology and Training Center, just down
yes,
the road between the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K-25 Atomic History Center. Now, I've talked to Ashley Stowe, and you have too, but I
yes.
know they're very interested in what's happening at the K-25 Interpretive Center. Is there some opportunity that we might pursue here to engage them in a project to develop in Oak Ridge something
Mhm.
similar, highly interactive like this, that we could include? And I think the opportunity may very well be at the Enrichment Center there at the Heritage Center of East Tennessee Technology Park near the K-25 Atomic History Center. And you may already be working that. Can you talk to that just a little bit?
Sure. And I think that's a great idea, Ray. I must admit at this point, we've talked to Ashley several times
Yeah.
about how can we at the AMSI exhibit incorporate some VR and AR that's utilizing some of their programming, as well as into some of our educational programming. How can we do that? I had not thought about what do we do in the interpretive center. So I think that's a very good idea.
Okay.
Ashley, I've known him for many years, and you're right that what they do there is almost like Star Trek, it feels like that. So how we do that and how we have the flexibility then as they advance down the road to then
Right.
advance with them, I
Hmm.
think would be great. So we found that this Decision Points Theater and the other interactive things, that's where it's at now. That's how you can teach a lot of lessons,
Hmm.
engage people that at different levels of interest. People who think they don't like history or they don't like science, suddenly they like it. They're really involved with it. We had something else kind of like that. I'd also like to think about. We stole a little bit from the Truman Library. I know you've been there,
Yeah.
of how they work with students. At the Bush Library, we had the old Situation Room from the White House, the actual sit room they dismantled when they built a new one. So we had the furniture and the paneling and everything, and we put together there scenarios where high school kids would come in and assume roles as president, secretary of defense, and so forth, press secretary, and they'd have to work through a kind of a crisis scenario to talk about leadership and decision making, those types of things. So the more you can do that rather than just put script on a wall and an artifact in a case, the better you are. That script on the wall and artifact in the case has a place. We can't just be like an entertainment thing. We have to also have some of this some traditional elements as well. But yeah, Ashley Stowe Oak Ridge is full of so many brilliant people and brilliant projects. Sometimes the challenge is how do you understand everything going on and how do you kind of get it into a museum context? But I know we can.
And I think that is your challenge. You bring a
Uh-huh.
world of experience here from all of these opportunities you've had. This decision room being just the latest one that I'm thinking about. But I think uh, a it has a potential in Oak Ridge that doesn't exist anywhere else in the nation. In other words, the Ashley Stowe and his efforts
Mhm.
there are they're not state of the art. They're beyond state of the art. They're ahead
Yeah,
of any other place in the nation or the world. And
yeah,
we're so close, and they want to be a part of what we're doing. We just have to figure out what is the key opportunity
yeah.
and let them be included in it. So the last time I was down there, and I was I had Dick Groves with me, you know General Groves' grandson. We were down at the K-25 Atomic History Center, and we started talking about the kind of things that you and I are talking about now, just how to take museums and move them to the next stage where it needs to
Yeah,
be. And
yeah.
I thought, oh my goodness, I should have arranged for him to see the Oak Ridge Enhanced Technology and Training Center. So on a whim, I just picked up the phone and called Ashley Stowe. And I said, Ashley, I'm at K-25. I'm driving back to Oak Ridge. Can I pull in and talk to you a minute? And fortunately, he was able to do that. Now, I don't obviously don't recommend that, and I won't do that often. But I had Dick Groves, and I wanted him to see what we were doing. And oh, they took him in, put headphones on him, and
Wow,
immersed him right into the experience.
that
And
is true.
it just dawned on me I'm this close to it, but I hadn't even thought about taking him there. And that's what I'm getting at. We're right here, this close to it, and we hadn't thought about involving them in the
Oh,
in interpretive center. And
listen.
I'm not fussing. We're just
Oh,
talking
oh,
back and
oh.
forth, but brainstorming. But we do need to take full advantage of the technology that's capability that we have in Oak Ridge. So just
Uh,
leave that thought with you. And I apologize for interrupting your train of thought.
No, that's right. I will say also the other day I tasked educators or retasked them, reminded them that we need to create some specific curriculum for K-25.
Yeah.
Right now we use the same. And I said, maybe this is then the point where we can say this curriculum, these programs, let's talk to Ashley about how we start using them at the Interpretive Center. So we'll do that. We will do
Good.
that.
Very
All
good.
right. I want to note this. This was the day of the opening. President Obama and Mrs. Obama were there. Really a great moment of celebration and civility, as I say. They're all of them kind of laughing as we finished up the ceremony.
That's a tremendous photograph there. I like that one a lot.
Love that. I
Mhm.
left in 2016 to be director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. It's up in Springfield, Illinois, and it's a little different. It's not part of the National Archives system. Now a state agency. One of my main and successful initiatives when I got there was to remove it from being way down in the Illinois bureaucracy to being its own state agency, which we were able to get through the legislature with the support of Governor Rauner. And that really helped us immensely. It had seen some rough times, frankly. The budget had been cut in half, the staff had been cut in half. We got that all remedied with a great set of folks helping out. So it's a beautiful facility right there in Springfield. I highly recommend you go up and see it. It's a kind of separate museum and library. We were also the Illinois State Historical Library, so I learned a lot of Illinois history. It's on the Illinois Bicentennial Commission while I was there. They were having such a hard time staffing that Bicentennial Commission. They hired me at the Lincoln Library. I was still in Dallas. They called me the next day and said, "Hey, would you also be head of the Bicentennial Commission?" And I don't really know that much about Illinois history yet. Maybe I'll be on the commission, but maybe you get someone else to head it up." So they did. Um,
Um,
you see there in the museum on the lower right is the Lincoln family life size. You get a great photo op right in front of the facade of the White House. So you can't see it on this, but when you walk in that big plaza in the museum, on the left is a log cabin, and that begins the early life experience. So you circle around through that up through his election. Then you come back out in this plaza. Then you go through the facade of the White House there into his presidency, up through the war, through his assassination, and return to Springfield. So a great exhibit. In the upper right, you see perhaps the thing most talked about, the ghost of the library. It's a holographic experience that talks about why museums and archives are important. And I know I've used this word a lot today, but it's a very touching experience. It's very poignant. And I don't know how many times I saw it, but every time left with a little tear in my eye at the end of it. Just really, really well done. They worked with some Disney folks when they put this museum together, and you can see their touch throughout. But one of the greatest, probably the greatest, along with the Library of Congress, greatest collection of Lincoln documents on the planet, and Mary Lincoln documents, Gettysburg Address, handwritten Emancipation Proclamation signed by Lincoln, 13th Amendment signed by Lincoln and members of Congress. Just one thing after the other that they had there in the archives. Oh, I'll put this in. I worked a lot with Fritz Klein and Pam Brown. We'd had a great theater department at Lincoln, and Mary, Pam was great as Mary Lincoln. Fritz was, I think, even greater. I mean, so much that I would call him Mr. President. He just, to me, he embodied Lincoln, and he was there a lot. He knew his Lincoln history. He knew how even, we have reports of how Lincoln spoke, oddly enough, kind of a higher pitch tone. And I think they just embodied it so well. So even though obviously I didn't get to meet President and Mrs. Lincoln, I feel like in ways I kind of did. They were there a lot working for and with us. I've met President Biden, but only when he was senator. I did not meet him during his presidency. And I have not met President Trump. I just put this in. I did get to go to an event at the Trump White House when in his first term. There I am taking it. There you see Vice President Pence beside him up there. I was there with a young lady, and the story is they had a great reception for us in the residence. And I'm sitting on this, I'm sure, historic bench with her, upholstered bench, and she dropped red wine on it. And, and she said to me, "What do we do?" And I said, "We walk away." And that's what. So I'm sure it's not the first time that's happened, but I wish they had not given us red wine. Now, I've been very lucky to be director of AMSI and the K-25 Atomic History Center. I rolled into town in November of 2019, and I've loved it here, but I wanted to keep my foot in the presidential world. So With a friend who's now moved on, Scott Brunn, we started the American POTUS podcast back in 2020 or 2021. I'm losing track of time again. But now that's 100, I think about 115, 120 episodes strong. It's become one of the highest rated history podcasts around. Listeners all over the world. I'm very proud of American POTUS. It's a nonprofit. We put together a nonprofit, and I hope down the road, right now it's just me. I even produce the thing now. I hope down the road to start putting together some subsidiary educational materials to go along with it. But I've interviewed really noted scholars and other folks that know so much about the presidency. So authors, historians, but also, for example, the other day I interviewed Susan Eisenhower, Ike's granddaughter. I've interviewed Clifton Truman Daniel as well. Skip Rutherford, who worked for Bill Clinton, an old friend, but also, Gordon Wood, Evan Thomas, David Stewart, Joseph Ellis. The list goes on in terms of the historians I've been able to connect with. Also, fairly recently, some old friends of mine in Washington run something called the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, or FLAIR. And they said, we love American POTUS. Can you do one on First Ladies? And so we started now American FLOTUS. And you can find that online as well. I think we have 3 episodes up. We'll soon have 4 episodes of that. So that's just starting, but it's been a great experience so far. So American POTUS and American FLOTUS, you can find them both at americanpotus.org. Or if you listen to podcasts and you go into Apple or Spotify, just put in those names and they'll pop right up. Now, I have to get back to AMSI before I run out of time. On March 7th, we're opening Ich bin ein Scientist, all about presidents and science over the years. We take different presidents. Let me go to the next slide here and talk about topics like engineering and the environment and space, national security, obviously energy, and explain how different presidents had a real impact on or were impacted by those topics. So, for example, did you know Abraham Lincoln is the only president so far to have been issued a patent? For many years, he had to do the flatboats, and river transportation was a big way to get around then. And he had been stranded one too many times by debris in rivers and creeks. And he's coming back. He had one term in Congress. He was coming back once on a boat, and he saw the captain put these in these big casks under the boat to help him get it over this obstacle. And he thought, well, wait a minute, maybe if we had something that could be inflatable under these boats, that we can inflate it and lift us over these obstacles. So he put together a plan. He had a fellow help him build a model, which you had to do back then, which the Smithsonian now owns, and he got issued a patent. I need to really sit down with the smart people here in Oak Ridge, because I've always heard that it wouldn't really work, that there are reasons why it wouldn't work. But I don't know that. I'm gonna be on the Abe's side right now. We're making our own little copy of that model here, because Smithsonian will not let it go. But we're gonna have a copy of that. A lot of interactive, fun stuff as part of this exhibit. Great videos, great photos, even cardboard cutouts of some of your favorite presidents. So it's going to be a blast. It opens on March 7th and will go through early November. So make sure you come here. I think we're having a ribbon cutting at 11 o'clock on March 7th, but then it will be open every day in our Innovators Gallery after that. So kind of the coming together of my two worlds, presidents and science. We have not a ton of space here to do it, but I think we've done a really good job of picking out specific presidents and talking about their love of science and their use of science. We're even talking about Ike and the interstates, for example. People know that Dwight Eisenhower was very instrumental in getting the interstates constructed. We start, by the way, with George Washington, who has a real interest in science. And we show that by this story that I just learned about not too long ago, where after he had been successful in the revolution, he was awaiting the treaty to come back, the signed treaty ending the revolution, ending the war. And he's at this house in New Jersey. And he invites his old friend Tom Paine down, to hang out with him. These giants together at this house, kind of hanging out. And they start talking. There's a river nearby, the Millstone River. And the legend is it would catch fire. Well, how is that possible that a river would catch fire? So they decided in true Enlightenment fashion, scientific method, to go out and do an experiment. So they row out there and they have different hypotheses of why it's happening, and they make the river catch on fire. We now know it's methane.
Hmm, hmm.
And Payne actually surmised that it's some gas, you know, rising up from the river, but they were able to make it happen. And so it was really the curiosity and the dedication to experiment that even our first president had. And you'd think he has so many other things on his mind, but that was also he wanted to go out and check it out with Payne. Payne, by the way, was there looking for some money. He had donated the proceeds of the books, Common Sense and so forth, to help with the cause, but now he was short on funds, and Washington was trying to help him.
What
So
an
I put,
interesting story. That's good.
yeah, I put some email, some website addresses on here. AMSI.org is the main place to go. If you're on Facebook, always check out AMSI on Facebook. That's where we post a lot of things. If you haven't signed up for the AMSI newsletter, you see it there in the lower left. It comes out every month electronically, do that. If you want, you can always email me, but also if you just go to the AMSI website, on the very bottom of the home page or the first page, you'll see where you can sign up for that newsletter. And if you're interested in the presidency or the first ladies, go to AmericanPOTUS.org. And I encourage you, if you haven't been to the presidential libraries and museums or the other presidential historic sites, the Park Service runs so many great historic sites. The Lincoln Home, for example, being one of those in Springfield. Go there as well. There's really so much history out there for the taking, and I've been very lucky to be part of it. All right, Ray.
Right. Very good, Alan. Thank you so much. Let's open up for some questions. Any of you have any question of Alan? You want to stop your share of the
Oh,
screen
yes, yes.
and
There you
we'll
go.
get it to
You
where
got it.
we get them back up here.
There you go. That
Change.
do it?
Yeah, that did it fine. Now, any of you that have questions for Alan, just unmute yourself and interact with him.
I can always be like Sergeant Schultz and say, I know nothing.
I'm always amazed at this Oracle class. I can't get them to talk. I've tried every way I know, but they're they are good students. In other words, they're here and they enjoy what we're doing, I'm thinking, or they wouldn't come back. But I also,
I always like to think, Ray, that I've expressed everything possible about the topic.
well, you have done a really good job of bringing your experience to this group, and I appreciate you for doing that.
Very,
And
very glad to do it.
I'm very sincere when I say that we're fortunate to have you and your experience here. And I've been well pleased with what you've done thus far, and I look forward to even greater things as we continue to take advantage of the nuclear renaissance that's taken place in Oak Ridge now, and just how does the museum fit into that, and what that as you might talk just a little more about what the plans are for K-25 location, if you don't mind, because I
Of
think
course.
we're getting close. I mean, come on, this is March. And,
Yeah,
they've
right.
been promising us that construction on that interpretive center would be completed. It may be April now, but they were saying March. So we're getting really close. Talk about what's going to be happening out there, if you would.
Sure,
And
sure. And
going forward, too.
I've heard maybe a September dedication. I don't know if that's right.
Yes, although they're going to complete the construction and they're going to put in exhibits,
Right.
their planning right now is for an 80th anniversary celebration in September, the ending of World War II, the 80th, and I don't know what else the city's going to be doing, but I know that the Department of Energy wants to coincide with that time during the year, and
Yeah.
that's when they plan to uh, have the public uh, opening for the public. but we're going to do some other things before then and
Yeah.
use that facility in some capacity. So just talk about what you know about what's going to happen.
Sure. So it's the Interpretive Center, which is being built right now next to the K-25 Atomic History Center, will include some terrific exhibits on the second floor about K-25, and you'll look out where the footprint is, where the plant used to be. When they first said this, Ray, I was like, well, that's nice. But when you go up there, you really see it's very impactful. You see how large, how gigantic
Yeah.
the K-25 plant was. So it's a great added experience to what we present in the History Center. I'm excited about helping to manage that. The bottom floor right now is fairly empty, and I like that because it gives us tons of space to do programming, to do things like we were talking about earlier with Ashley, to bring in school groups, to have different events there. So we're very excited about the Interpretive Center being added at some point this year. Certainly, we think by September being open to the public. But again, a great addition to the site. The other addition to the site that will happen probably around the same time frame is the renovation of Portal 4. If you know, as you're coming into the site, when you take a left on Enrichment going up toward the History Center and the Interpretive Center, right there in the corner, you'll see the old portal where people used to check in to go to work, right? Ray, you have correct me on this. And it's in some bad state of disrepair right now. But the Community Reuse Organization of East Tennessee, or CROET, is renovating that for the AMSI Foundation and will deed that over to us at some point later this year to be used as a welcome center to the site. So we'll have a small shop in there, museum shop. We'll have a coffee shop, we hope. We'll have space for food trucks. We'll have a small exhibit that talks about the history of the site, what's going on in the site right now, a little bit about Croat, and a little bit about railroads, because the Southern Appalachian Railroad Museums also has a great presence on that site. And we talked to them about how we collaborate together to not only have some elements of that small exhibit talking about it, but perhaps an exhibit of some of the railroad cars they have out there too. So, all dependent upon how the project goes budget wise, we'll show off either 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those railroad cars right across the street, right across Enrichment from the portal when everything is said and done. So, I'm excited about that. It's going to be a whole new site with that and other landscaping and lighting and paving improvements that Croat is doing as it phases out. It's a real exciting space for us, and I think for the community this year.
So let me add to that and plant another idea in your
Mhm.
brain, as if you
Oh, okay.
as if you don't have enough to think about.
Yeah.
When they finish the footprint of the K-25 building and make that accessible and available for viewing, one of
Yeah.
the things that they plan to do is to put poles at the corners of that structure. In other words, that will help show the height of what
Yeah.
the structure actually was. Now,
Right.
what I would like you and others that might help me to think about is what are they going to do on on those poles? Right now,
Mm.
I think they're planning to put banners up. In other
Yeah.
words, it won't be a flagpole where you raise and lower flags, but they may
Mhm.
have banners. The other thought that I have is why don't we put some mirrors up on the top of the poles and get us a laser exhibit that would,
Mhm.
in the evening, early evening, could show, with a little bit of artificial fog raised up to make the beams viewable, that would actually show the outline of the building as a laser show.
Mm.
Now, I don't
Right.
know, I don't know if that's even feasible, but I don't think it would be all that expensive to put a small laser up
I,
and pop it off of those mirrors. Let's
you-
you and I explore that a little bit and see if it's
I love it.
feasible.
I love it. You didn't have to go any further than saying the word laser, Ray. I was in. I was at that point. I think that's a great idea. Let me talk to Quinn about it too and see what
Please.
he thinks. I think that's a great idea of how you help envision again, the immensity of that building.
Yeah, and I think those poles are going to help. Don't get me wrong, but I
Yeah.
believe if we could see a laser beam flowing around that, now you have to remember that's 44 acres.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. How do you do that? But no,
And
we can figure.
I don't know if I'm completely out of reason or not, but I think with somebody with a little more technical depth than I have ought to explore whether or not a laser show is a feasible thing.
I bet you somewhere in Oak Ridge, someone knows the answer to
Uh,
that.
Okay, folks, last chance. Is there anything you'd like to ask Alan before he leaves? And he's done a wonderful job for us today. But if you have any
I have
questions,
a quick question.
please, Terry,
Yes.
go for it.
Hey,
All
listen,
right.
can you touch base again, Alan? What exhibit starts on March 7th and where is it going to be held? Is it at the Heritage Center?
It's
I
at
didn't catch
AMSI.
all of that.
That's okay. It's at AMSI and American Museum of Science and Energy. It opens at 11 a.m. on March 7th. We'll have a ribbon cutting, and it will be open through early November. All about presidents and science. So that's starts with Washington, goes up through. I think the last one is Bill Clinton. We talk about the Human Genome Project as well. So yeah, a lot of fun stuff there on March 7th, starting March 7th.
Okay, so it's all part of the regular
Yeah.
exhibit there at AMSE.
It
Okay.
is. It's in what we call the Innovators Gallery, where we change out. Usually in that gallery, we talk about different technologies, but every now and then we do other topics. We just had a fun ghost exhibit in there for Halloween and the ghost of Christmas, and then we'll do this one. And we're looking at other topics down the road that get back to more of a technological focus. But I knew from the beginning, and Jim Campbell encouraged me in this too, our chairman of our board, to do something about presidents. I knew I had to. And so this is the perfect time to do it.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Sure, no, thank you.
Excellent. Anyone else? Yes, Jackie?
I think this was a wonderful presentation, and I also think the two of you make a pretty good team.
I think so
Oh,
Thank
too,
you.
Jackie.
Thank you
Thank you.
ever so much. It was wonderful.
Wonderful. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
very good. I'll pay you later. All right. If there's no other questions, let me see if I can do something here. Let me bring this up. And ideas you have for the next class. And again, that's just for our 3 sessions this time, or as long as you all keep coming back, we will keep doing this each session. So if you've got some ideas, you can either put them up here, put them in the chat, or you can send me an email or call me any way to get the information to me. And we will include those every time. Now, I'll also put this session up on YouTube, and I'll send out a link so that you can get to it, and anyone that was not able to attend can get it as well. I can't resist this, Alan. That's what the K-25 footprint looks like from a zoom or a drone shot.
Yeah.
This is the viewing or the interpretive center under construction, and then that's the
great.
footprint.
Yeah.
Couldn't resist.
That's great. I'm glad you did that. That's really a great show.
Very good. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate your attentiveness today. And Alan, thank you for a wonderful presentation on the president.
Thank you, Ray. I enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Yep.